Before we go on to the next panel, I do just want to say a few things. First, I want to reiterate the Senator's gratitude for Senator Portman and his team for allowing us the use of this space. We're only able to do these events each year because of Senate offices, and it's a burden on their time, obviously, as they try to pull together details for us, and we're very, very grateful for that. We think it's important to maintain conversations with Congress and in Congress on these issues, which, even though our program is called the Center for the Study of the Administrative State, it all really begins with Congress. And so we're grateful for the ability to have these events here. Second, I do want to make special mention of the other folks who make all this possible, which is the Gray Center's staff, the team. They've been working around the clock lately on this event and others. If you've been keeping an eye on the number of events we've been doing lately and the events yet to come, it's a lot, and we're already looking ahead, planning next year. We're booking rooms for the fall of 2020 the other day. And so they're very, very busy, and we're grateful for everything that they do. And also, I want to say we're very, very grateful for the work of the students. There's a number of Scalia Law School students who have been helping with today's event. They're in the middle of their final exams. I guess they wanted to escape exams for a day. But we're very, very grateful for the effort that they put into this, especially at the time of year when they're busiest, or when they should be busiest. Just so you know about some of the next upcoming events, on May 22nd at the Decatur House near the White House, where we've been having a lot of downtown DC events, we're going to have an event to mark the one-year anniversary of President Trump's executive orders on the civil service. So we're going to have a day-long conversation about various aspects of those orders and on the relationship between the White House, the President, and the administration. Then, looking ahead to next fall, we have a number of events, but I especially want to note that in October we'll have the second annual George Mason Law Review Administrative Law Symposium, our second sort of collaboration with the students of the George Mason Law Review. Last year we focused on agency adjudication. This year we're calling the theme the administration of democracy. And we're looking at a number of election law and other political law issues through the lens of administrative law and public administration. And we're already lining up some great authors for that, and a dual keynote conversation with former White House counsel Don McGahn and former White House counsel Robert Bauer. Having those two together in conversation, talking about two issues that they're very familiar with, public administration and campaign finance laws. And just so you know, we'll soon announce our research priorities for the coming year. They'll come out online, but I'm shared among friends here. The 4 topics we think we've zeroed in on are civil service and presidential administration, regulation of big tech companies, facts, science, and expertise in the administrative state, and then finally, fittingly for today, Congress. For each of these topics, we will dedicate significant resources to encouraging legal scholars and political scientists to study these issues, first preparing private working draft papers, and then later to discuss those papers at one of the conferences on campus in next year and the year ahead. So we hope you'll join us all for that. Now, having said all that, let me introduce our third and final panel. We've called this panel Rediscovering Congress's Institutional Ambition. And needless to say, that's a reference to James Madison's famous words in Federalist 51, that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected to the constitutional rights of the place. For Madison, this was a key to the separation of powers and our checks and balances. And we thought there'd be no better way to end today's conversation than a discussion of Congress as an institution in those terms. And I could think of no better speakers on this subject than our 3 panelists today. I'll introduce them all now from the podium. The first speaker will be Yuval Levin. Yuval is Vice President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and founding editor of National Affairs, a truly indispensable policy journal. His most recent book is The Fractured Republic: Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. And he spent a lot of time in the last couple of years focusing on institutions and institutions in American constitutionalism. So we're very grateful that he could join us today. Our second speaker will be Christopher DeMuth. Chris is a distinguished senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he writes on Congress and the administrative state. And I'm proud to add, he is a distinguished senior fellow of the Gray Center. From 1986 to 2008, he served as president of the American Enterprise Institute, and before that, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs for President Reagan. And our third speaker will be Matthew Spalding. Dr. Spalding is the Hillsdale College's Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs, overseeing the operations of Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., not far from here. Prior to joining Hillsdale, Dr. Spalding was the Heritage Foundation's Vice President of American Studies and founding director of its B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics. He is the best-selling author of We Still Hold These Truths, Rediscovering Our Principles, Reclaiming Our Future, a key book on America's founding principles. So, Yuval, let's begin.
Thank you very much, Adam. I appreciate it, and thank you to you and to the Gray Center for hosting this event, which has been extraordinarily interesting and valuable, and taking up this crucial set of questions. I'm particularly glad to see that the question before this panel is framed as a matter of congressional ambition or constitutional ambition, because I really think that is a core problem at the moment and the right way to think about the nature of that problem. Our system is built on an assumption of intense legislative ambition. The Constitution gives the Congress powers but not responsibilities, we might say. The President is required to execute the laws and has to respond to changing events on the country's behalf. The courts have to at least consider cases and controversies that come before them and to apply the laws. But although the general scope and reach of Congress's authorities are laid out in Article 1, the institution is not really told what it has to do within that scope. The assumption was that Congress would run as far and as hard as the Constitution allowed it to, so that what was really needed was a set of boundaries on what it could do. That assumption is made plain in the writings of the framers, especially James Madison, who thought that a basic premise of Republican government was that the legislature would exhibit a kind of unquenchable ambition. As he put it famously, and we always quote this line in events like this about what's happened to Congress, Congress would always be extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. And you can walk around Capitol Hill and look for that vortex these days, and it would be kind of hard to find. Madison thought that this intense ambition that would in itself be unstoppable was really a core reason for dividing the powers of the government and for dividing the Congress itself. In Republican government, he wrote in Federalist 51, the legislative authority necessarily predominates, and the remedy is to divide the legislature into different branches. Looking at how our system works now, you'd have to say that that doesn't really seem to be happening. We on the right are used to complaining about national politics in terms of hyperactivity by presidents and judges, but it's become increasingly clear that a bigger problem, and maybe to some degree the cause of the other problems, is something like legislative underactivity. Not necessarily in terms of a shortage of legislation, which might not be the end of the world, but in terms of intentionally vague congressional action, vague legislation that leaves huge questions unaddressed and that expects the other two branches to figure things out, alongside just sheer dysfunction and inability to have the process work. Broad delegations of power in statutes have let presidents wield what properly ought to be thought of as some legislative powers. Intentionally vague legislation empowers judges to fill the gaps that kind of delegation creates. And members of Congress are very happy to complain about the other branches when this happens, but they're not inclined to use the enormous power that is at their disposal to restrain those competing institutions and to reassert the prerogatives of their own institutions. We've seen this in recent years in healthcare, in education, energy, in banking regulation, across the full scope of domestic affairs. And of course, the Congress's abandonment of its role in foreign policy has been, if anything, even more comprehensive than that. That presidents and judges would have rushed to capitalize on these kinds of opportunities is not surprising. They are ambitious, as the framers knew they would be. The question is, why would Congress willfully create such opportunities for the other branches? How could there be a shortage of legislative ambition? What was it that Madison missed? I think Madison did not get the psychology of politicians wrong. People who run for Congress are still very ambitious, very driven, but their ambitions now are channeled away from the institution of the Congress itself and from traditional legislative activity and redirected along at least two paths that I think are related but distinct. The first of them is partisan. As polarization has increased, members of Congress have grown more inclined to understand their own political and policy ambitions in partisan terms, and so to see themselves as part of a team that extends well beyond Congress. That means especially that when they're in the president's party, they usually work to advance the president's priorities because they agree with them and because they expect that success for the president would redound to their own benefit. Obviously, that it has to slacken the institutional tensions that are supposed to keep our constitutional system in balance. And that's how we find congressional Democrats earlier in this decade calling on President Obama to assert the authority to rewrite immigration laws on his own, seemingly unconcerned about legislative prerogatives. It's also how we find Republicans asking President Trump to use his powers to do things that could and should be done with legislation, from protecting religious liberty to enabling oil drilling along the coasts to building a border wall. But members don't simply subsume their own ambition beneath that of their party. Ambitious people have pride, they want prominence, and that remains as true now as it was in Madison's time. But it points, I think, to the second and maybe even more pernicious kind of redirection of ambition that's a distinct disorder of the Congress in the 21st century, and that results in a more complicated kind of dereliction of congressional responsibility. Simply put, a lot of members of Congress have come to see themselves, first and foremost, as players in a larger political ecosystem, the point of which is not legislating or governing exactly, but a kind of performative outrage for a partisan audience. Their incentives are rooted in that understanding of our politics, and so often are just not really about legislating. They do remain intensely ambitious, but their ambition is for a prominent role in the theater of our national politics. They view the institution of Congress as a particularly effective platform for themselves, as a way to raise their profile, to become celebrities in the world of cable news or talk radio, locally or nationally, to build a bigger social media following, in essence, to perform. And they can best use that platform not by engaging in the mundane work of legislating, but by taking part in dramatic spectacles and by fueling the outrage that is now the engine of our politics. Even for its own members, Congress seems to be most valuable as an object for commentary, as a prop in a morality tale about corruption. And so a lot of members come here just to complain, and especially to complain about Congress. And a huge amount of what they end up doing once they arrive here is channeling public frustration with the institution that they ran so hard to join. Congress, like any serious institution, has to function by socializing its members to work together. But when those members see the institution as a stage for their individual performances, they often don't become socialized in that way. They're left in a kind of antisocial form, each trying to shine on his own or her own. They often can't wait to rush off the floor of the House or the Senate to find a camera and to tell a waiting viewing public just how badly broken Washington is. And that makes accommodations very hard to come by. It makes legislating more difficult and more rare. It has everything to do, I think, with why so little gets done in Congress and why every budget process seems to end with the threat of a shutdown. But this is also exacerbated further by a related loss of protected spaces for deliberation in Congress. An institution needs an inner life, a sanctum where it can really do its work. And Congress has progressively lost that inner life as every one of its deliberative spaces has become a performative space. Everything has become televised. There's less and less room and time for talking in private. And by this point, the leadership offices around midnight as a government shutdown is approaching are almost the only places you can actually speak in private. And it shouldn't be that surprising that they're almost the only places where serious legislating on major issues actually gets done. So that the various reforms that have been intended to democratize the Congress and increase transparency have actually resulted in a less democratic and less accountable institution. And when you combine that with some related reforms also intended very often to curtail corruption, the elimination of earmarks and other things, it becomes easier to see why the intense ambition that legislators do have finds itself directed to things other than legislating, and so in turn why Congress seems so dysfunctional. None of that really points to any easy answers, of course. In fact, although pretty much everybody who watches Congress, including its members, seems to agree now that institutional reforms are necessary, there's not much agreement about just what those kinds of reforms should actually aim to achieve. I think that one key to thinking about reforming the institution is precisely the revival of legislative ambition, per se. That means that reforms have to give members more to do and press on Congress's advantages in the interbranch competition. I think budget reforms would be especially crucial to that kind of change. For instance, as was mentioned earlier today, by collapsing the distinction between authorization and appropriation And by breaking up some of the consolidated budget process we have into smaller, more discrete portions of legislative activity, you could start to get members more invested in the work of legislating and to diminish some of the president's advantages in budgeting. Some reforms of the committee system and of the management of the House and Senate floor could help along similar lines too. But in any case, the goal should be to put Congress in the position of driving toward accommodations and taking greater control of the system, doing more legislating and more of the things that only a legislature can do. Legislative ambition, connecting the interests of the man with the constitutional rights of the place, as Madison put it, ought to be the goal. Now, to say that we are far from a Congress whose members see that as their goal would, I think, be a great understatement. The pressure somehow will have to come from the outside in large part, whether in the constitutional system or from the outside in terms of getting ideas into the bloodstream and talking to members about how things could be different. One of the really striking things for me in working with members on these kinds of ideas over the years is that there is not a tendency now to think in terms of institutional reforms. There's not a sense that if you're so unhappy with the budget process, maybe you could change the budget process. Maybe you have a vote in this body. Maybe you could press leadership. Maybe you're in a position to make some differences. Members are not inclined to think of themselves as able to change the way the place works, and so have organized their own thinking and their own ambitions around the ways in which it does work. You have to do some of both in order to make this kind of change possible. But every step counts, and so I think talking about it in the way we're doing here is enormously important, and helping members think about themselves in terms of institutional ambition and helping make them jealous of Congress's prerogatives is an essential way to start. I'll end there.
Thanks, Yuval. Chris?
Is this?
There you go.
Okay. Am I working? In my view, congressional revival is not an inside the Beltway issue. I think it's a national issue of fundamental importance, that the decline of representative government, of lawmaking by elected representatives, and the substitution of declarative government, lawmaking by bureaucracies and by courts through simple declaration, is an important cause of many of the political problems of our time. It was always a part of the idea of Republican legitimacy, that we all understood that the laws that we lived under, even if they didn't meet with our own views, even if they were sharply different from our own views, at least had been made through a process of representative government, where people of my views and people of your views worked together, negotiated, compromised, and if my side lost, maybe we'll win next year. That is not the nature of most of the laws that we live under today. They're created by specialized missionary bureaucracies for the most part, and I believe that returning a large share of the making of laws to a representative legislature is a matter of first importance. I like a lot of the proposals for doing so that have been talked about in detail or referenced today. The first proposal for requiring frequent reauthorization of laws. I like consolidating authorization and appropriation. I like budget reform. I think that the committee and especially specialty offices staffs could be beefed up to counter the over-transparency problem that you've all mentioned. I would like to see markups, at a minimum, markup sessions at the committee level be private. I would go further and make votes behind those closed door according to secret ballot. I'd like to make more use of the committee of the whole. I like the REINS Act. I'm one of those who would reform the Senate filibuster for legislation. We have a very rich agenda out there for restoring congressional power in the exercise of its constitutional duties. And as far as I can tell, virtually nobody who is in the Congress is interested in any of them. A year ago, Senator Lee, who was one of the few who is, started an Article 1 initiative for restoring congressional ambition. I think he got 9 members of both houses. Several of them, I think, were then defeated for re-election. And as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a posting on their website in nearly a year. When particular issues came up that were naturals for reassertion, such as to require that major changes in tariffs be approved by the Senate, there was very little interest. Some people who didn't like what President Trump was doing on policy or constitutional grounds, when they thought about it, the idea that they'd actually be taking votes on a bunch of tariffs dissuaded them. I think that the reasons for congressional decline and the fact that we have a new congressional business model that Yuval has discussed are very, very deep and long-standing. I think the essential causes are that we have become a very wealthy society, and an affluent society is one that generates many, many more issues that people expect to be resolved politically, not just the old-fashioned issues of economic performance in domestic policy, but health, safety, environmental issues, individual dignity, access, non-discrimination, many, many more. And many, many more than a representative legislature can handle, frankly, and that it has responded by, beginning in about 1970, by delegating broad areas of political controversy to the executive branch. I think that the fact that many, many more people are politically active in modern society has supercharged the public sphere, and that new technologies in communications and transportation have radically lowered the cost of political organization, both on the supply side and the demand side, so that we have the new model of the member of the House or the Senate as essentially a solo practitioner, no longer dependent on the old political hierarchies, city machines, the national political parties, the old congressional hierarchies, which were dismantled beginning in the early 1970s, but works through affinity networking with ideological and interest group that support the individual member. Lots of quality time on social media, lots of fundraising, personal fundraising, and in general, as Yuval said, strutting and fretting on the national political stage and making poses blessedly relieved of the very difficult nitty-gritty of compromise and settling for half-loaves in the construction of our laws. So I think it is both very difficult. I am in favor of the various initiatives. The House has set up a select committee on reform. Phil Wallach, who spoke this morning, is involved with that group. I wish them well. People are looking for little, not hammers, as we said earlier, but wedges, little slivers, little things that might build confidence among the members for actually going back to legislating. I'm all for that. But my own interest is trying to find ways that pressures can be brought to bear from the outside. My view is that things happen in politics through activism when you pick a fight, and I think that Congress needs to be rattled from the outside and challenged rather than simply sit around these halls and think about how it might do a better job. I'd like to focus on The two most obvious sources of external pressure, the other two departments, branches of the federal government. There is now, I think, a very good chance that starting in this Supreme Court term and in the next couple of years, the courts are going to revive to a degree the old non-delegation doctrine and are going to be revising their various Chevron and other doctrines of elaborate deference to the discretion of agencies. Adams' predecessor as head of this of the Gray Center, Judge Rao, wrote an important paper saying that a good bit of congressional dysfunction is because the courts have permitted them to pretty much get away with anything in ducking hard decisions and turning them over to the executive branch. And I think that we're going to be seeing the revival of some doctrines that are going to put put pressure back on the Congress. However, these are going to, I believe, have limited effect. They will be limited to litigated cases. The decisions are not going to be welcomed by Congress or by the agencies. The agencies have fantastic discretionary power. They don't have to work through rulemaking or adjudication. When those mechanisms are constrained, they can work through guidance documents. When those documents are constrained, they can work simply through using threats of enforcement or promises of non-enforcement to keep their coalitions in place. At many of the agencies, the people that have repeated dealings before the agency know that the first rule is, if you fight and win, you lose. That has a huge effect on the cases that actually come before judges and greatly limits the capacity of the legislative branch to affect the sorts of changes that I think are required. So I want to focus on what will seem to, I think, almost everybody in this room to be the most unlikely source of congressional reform, which is the president. This seems strange because the president appears to have gained, the executive branch has gained a vast lawmaking power over the decades. Why would the president want a revived constitutional rival, want the other political branch under the Constitution to be stronger than it is today? I'm going to pass over this. I think it is not inconceivable. I think it is very difficult. The changes in society, politics, technology that have transformed the Congress have also transformed the presidency. Since the Reagan administration, the president has become an increasingly partisan character who is expected to deploy the instruments of executive government to shore up his political coalition, to protect and promote his party in the Congress, so that the prospects for what I'm going to describe in just a moment may seem to be very limited. However, the president's interests are different from those of the bureaucracy that sits under him. President Trump is not the first president to discover that the deep state opposes him and constrains him and works to hurt him. This is much more pronounced in Republican than in Democratic administrations, but Republicans do get to be president. Some of the things I'm proposing could appeal to them, and politics is very difficult to predict. The executive branch is, under the Constitution, one person that permits changes in political calculation that can be quicker, more binary than the sorts of changes we can expect under the for Article 1 Congress with the very slow-moving changes in a large bicameral legislature. I'll have more to say about that in a moment, but what I want to do is to point out that we have a few recent cases, some disappointments, where the president has taken some political hot potatoes and tossed them back to Congress. President Trump did so twice in his first year. One was, but they were both concerned with initiatives of President Obama, which had been pretty wildly beyond statutory authorization under anybody's assessment. That was the DAPA immigration order and the expenditure of billions of dollars on certain Obamacare purposes that had no congressional appropriations. I think those might have lost in court, were likely to have lost in court, but the president simply turned them back to Congress, withdrew them from court, said, I'm not going to do either of those. He strongly suggested that he would pass them as long as they were enacted along with other priorities in immigration and health care policy that he had. But he has missed some opportunities to do what I want, which is to take more issues and turn them over to publicly ask Congress to pass legislation and recommend what he would like. After the Las Vegas terrorist attack a year ago fall, there was a good deal of argument that bump stocks should be banned. Currently, under federal law, machine guns are banned. Semi-automatic rifles are not. The difference is that in a machine gun, there's an internal mechanism that fires automatically. If you put a bump stock over a semi-automatic, it actually just uses the recoil against the finger to convert it into a machine gun. That's the law under the executive branch rules that have been issued over a long period of time. I think that there was very strong support for including bump stocks into the ban on the federal ban on machine guns. And there's a good reason that should have been considered by Congress. That's a major step. The federal agency involved had approved the use of bump stocks over a long period of time, but the Trump administration simply issued a rule saying, oh, bump stocks are machine guns too, so they've just reversed the bureaucratic rule. The reason they did so, I'm quite certain, is that the congressional leaders told President Trump they didn't want to vote on this. Now, that was a case where the president should have turned it over to Congress, and he should have said, this is a major change in policy. We don't really have the authority. We'd have to stretch the laws that you have passed to make the change. I'm not going to do it without you, and he should have turned that over to Congress. I want the president to do that a lot, and I would note that Senator Romney, when he was running for president, he said that the Congressional Reins Act, which had passed a couple of times the House, not the Senate during the Obama first term, he said, when I'm president, I'm going to follow reins, even without a rein statute. If we have major $100 million rulemakings in the executive branch, we're going to come up with the rules, and I'm going to send them to the House and Senate and say that if you pass these, I will send it on to the Federal Register. If you don't, I will not. I would like to see a president begin to do that with major legislation. The president could start small. Every president has had these look-back exercises where you pull out silly and ridiculous and obsolete rules that are floating around in the Code of Federal Regulations and abolish them. President Obama made a big deal that an EPA rule classified milk as a hazardous waste. And he made a lot of fun about that. But if it's in the rule book, you've got to go through notice and comment rulemaking. So why not take a bunch of those, give them to Congress, let members of Congress take credit for, with a flourish, getting rid of all these stupid old rules. And at the same time, completely allied the need for going through administrative process. A little confidence building for the members of Congress. They can actually take a hard vote and survive the tweets and outrages of lobby groups, live to vote another day. After the Supreme Court begins holding that certain forms of delegation are overbroad, take a bunch of those overbroad statutes and send any additional rules under those statutes to Congress for specific approval. There are a lot of problems with what I'm proposing. If we did this, one that is on the docket downtown right now is revision of the CAFE standards. The Obama administration left behind a completely implausible, a kind of an impossible set of goals for CAFE. The administration is changing it. 1 minute?
3.
Oh, okay. I thought that had been there for 3.
It had been, but
okay. The administration is proposing to revise them. It is a huge change in policy. It is something that is worthy of congressional decision-making. It's enormously important to the future of major industries, to consumers. It's the sort of thing that ought to be a law. And I believe that it would be better if the administration fired its best shot, came up with the rule that it thinks is the right reform of CAFE, send it to Congress, and say, this is what we propose. We ask that you vote for it, up or down, don't amend it, don't change it, but just we want you to approve this as it is, and once you do, we're going to send it over to the government printing office, and it will be the law of the land. But of course, a political operative has said, that's crazy. You're trying to relax an Obama-era rule. And the House, have you noticed, Chris, is actually run by the Democrats right now? They will stonewall the whole thing. They will never pass it. My view is that the CAFE standards are a lot less important than restoring congressional balance. And I'm for the president sending a lot of things up there, some of which will disadvantage him in the immediate moment, some of which won't. And I would like to see the lobbyists for the various groups with an interest in the CAFE standards to go to work on the House Democrats and see what the result is. Congress will be very unhappy with this. A year ago, President Trump proposed rescissions of $60 billion of appropriations under the 74 Budget Act, which permits the president to propose rescissions. The result, the bipartisan horror that they would actually have to vote on these things was so great that he reduced it to $15 billion, which actually passed the House, did not pass the Senate. It was a highly partisan vote, but it wasn't completely partisan because, there were a lot of debates when it gets down to the nitty-gritty. You'd find this in the CAFE standards as well. They cut across partisan lines, and it was not a strictly party vote. However, there was bipartisan affront. People were astonished that the president would revive this old law and ask them to actually make some minor adjustments to federal spending. So that shows what we are up against. But I think that the potential of presidential referral of major items that could be resolved by the executive branch but are better resolved by Congress is something that we ought to talk about. One of the reasons it sounds so strange is that I don't think anybody's ever said what I've just said before, and maybe nobody will ever say it again because it's so preposterous. But the point of meetings like this, of academic policy work, is to try to put together ideas which often seem extremely implausible in the moment, precisely because you cannot predict what the twists and turns of politics are going to be in the future. Congress is terribly unpopular, but as David Mayhew keeps pointing out, if you ask people in polls, who do you think should make our laws? They say Congress should be making the laws. There's great support for that. The idea that we have so many laws written by unaccounted bureaucrats, that really does have popular resonance. You could imagine a turn in politics or some major controversy or of one sort or another, where somebody on the campaign trail, somebody who is in office, who's looking for something to do. So what do I do about this situation? This is an idea that I want to get out there for people to argue about and refine and improve so that it is part of our storehouse of ideas that practical politicians might find attractive at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Actually, we're going to borrow that line now on all of our marketing materials. Will be the Gray Center, extremely implausible in the moment. Thank you very much for that. Our third speaker is Matthew Spalding. And Dr. Spalding, Chris mentioned along the way Senator Lee's Article 1 initiative. If I remember correctly, wasn't that unveiled at the Kirby Center, or you didn't?
It was.
That?
It was.
Yeah. You should do another one.
There's lots to be done.
Yeah.
Thanks, and it's great to be with you, and thank you, Adam. And I also have to commend what you guys are doing out at your center. And it's great to be with Yuval and Chris Demuth, two very good scholars on this who have written for some time, and I always like to hear what they have to say. So I've actually just enjoying being there. What I'd like to do is take a few moments and maybe back up a little bit, because I was actually intrigued by Adam's question about ambition, which of course reminds us of the Federalist Papers, but I wanted to think that through a little bit more and think about what that might mean. But I also want to talk and think more broadly about this idea of the administrative state. I think very often, and I think many of us are guilty of this as well, we talk often about we describe the symptoms, and I think it's actually good sometimes to step back and think about the fundamentals, about what some of the underlying factors are. I've been here and thinking about these questions since studying with my teachers at Claremont, and who have been thinking about this for some time, and I've been watching it here in Washington, D.C. for 20 plus years. And it strikes me that we're kind of in a turning point moment. And if it's fair to describe the development of government, the idea of representative law and constitutional rule and a judiciary as the most significant accomplishment of human liberty, really, in the American founding, the revolution we are trying to describe, the change that's come over our government, this thing called the administrative state, has really been the most important revolution since then. A complete rearranging of our constitutional system. In large sense, a shift of power away from our law-making institutions of Republican government to various forms of an oligarchy, aptly described by my colleagues here, this idea of the administrative state, not merely a flawed methodology, I think it's important for us to recognize, but really a new form of government. Indeed, I think we've come to the point where we are operating in a regime that has two separate forms of government which are at odds with each other, two different ways of ruling. And we really have to see everything in that light, including Congress. And with that, I'm struck by the extent to which how much the modern clash is really a result of a deeper debate about how we understand human nature, which of course is at the heart of Madison's understanding of the separation of powers. But after all, of course, what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? And this made me think, of course, of the great opening question of the Federalist, whether we are capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on their political constitutions, on accident and force. This was what the founders were trying to solve. They were nervous or worried, fearful of power. Because, of course, before that, legitimacy, the questions of right, had always been united with political power. Who had the power had the rights. And they turned to nature as a source of rights, a proper understanding, a better source of understanding of human rights. But that, of course, directed them towards the problems or the concerns, the challenges of human rights, of human nature, because that points to the problem of power being encroaching. But of course, you can't remove that. You can't remove accident and choice from human affairs. You can't control it the way Machiavelli or Hobbes wanted to, by absolute power. And they solve this through this doctrine of constitutionalism, best explained in the Federalist Papers. But broadly speaking, it distinguishes rights, legitimacy based on the laws of nature, nature's God, the Declaration, and powers as they're laid out in the Constitution, broken into its various functions, legislative, executive, judiciary. How do you deal with the problems, the challenges, however? Well, writ large, of course, the problem is the problem of faction, because that's sown in the nature of man. You can't extinguish it. You can't give them the same opinions. That would destroy liberty, so we expand the orbit and have more of a diversity of opinions. Within government, you have the problem of ambition. Power is attractive, it turns out. Indeed, that's a negative, but also a positive, because of the love of fame, the ruling passion of the noblest minds. So you prevent concentration of powers by giving each the means and motives to resist encroachment. You give them some powers to the others, we call checks and balances. But the motivation to the solution actually is human nature. Ambition counteracts ambition. The interest of the man must be connected to the rights of the place. You don't get rid of it, but you harness it. Depends on the people's primary control, but we must have auxiliary precautions. We must provide a defect of better motives, what they call the inventions of prudence. And the separation of powers, of course, is the central one, the most important, the structural constitution. This changes with the rise of the progressives, who wanted to have government become a vehicle for historical progress rather than a reflection on permanent nature. They wanted to make American government administrative. MAGA. That was a joke. The first MAGA. But in order to make it free of political influence, they had to separate administration and politics. A theory you see throughout its numerous progressive writings. In many ways, I think that's one of their key ideas. That is, the idea of reflection choice, the founders' preference over accident and force, is replaced by administration, which for them is more rationalisms, especially rationalizations based on science, and politics, by which they mean opinion, which they want to minimize as much as possible. But the assumption behind all this vast discretion and what we eventually know as vast delegations is their trust or optimism about selflessness, competence, objectivity of administrators, largely thanks to science, which is to say they didn't worry about human nature in the way that the founders did. Human nature is either good, which the optimistic progressive thought, but at the very least it's malleable. It's evolving. It can be made progressive. The separation of powers is no longer necessary, or even just for that matter. And the fears of the founders no longer apply in the modern era. We can be freed of the shackles placed on it by the separation of powers, and government can now pursue its new tasks. Which is why Woodrow Wilson spends probably the biggest amount of time in his writings going after precisely that mechanism. They believed history had solved the problem of faction, and that human nature had solved the problem that human nature was a danger to democracy, and that power can now be unfettered, and the state can grow and expand everywhere to achieve progress without fearing the threat of tyranny. How has that worked out? Well, we're all generally familiar, you've spent the day discussing the various elements of that. Congress, at first, reluctantly, when we actually go back and look at the history of the debates, reluctantly, but then with much gusto, delegates its powers to these administrators, the administrative branch, the bureaucracy, whatever we want to call it. But come the 1970s or so, they actually accommodated themselves to this new administrative state, such that today most laws are made by departments and agencies, not by Congress at all. And Congress essentially made itself into an oversight body, mostly doing ex post facto lawmaking by fixing things after someone else has made a mistake. But in doing so, they actually are giving away and have given away and diluted many of the checks they had, which is the heart of separation of powers. The budget, which I think is their best power, the most likely avenue for reviving their authority, is really in many ways disappointingly ineffective, or at least thus far it's proven ineffective, largely because the way they have organized committees and the process has proven ineffective to do the work. Congress, in my opinion, has no ambition because they don't have interests which are connected to the constitutional rights of the place. And because they've delegated much of their power, they have little ability to control it. And to the extent that there is ambition, which I suppose there is, and I think you all have made this point, it tends to be broadly national, looking at national agendas and towards the presidency. We see this especially in the United States Senate. It seems to me the problem at the heart of all this, which say the liberal project of modern government, is that on the one hand, they've abandoned nature, but it's still there, in the form of ambition especially, but in various other forms we associate with politics, and it tends to come back very often with a vengeance and with pitchforks, perhaps. They've delegated their authority in the name of the rational state. They've accommodated themselves to it to a large extent, but lo and behold, much as politics over the 20th century turns out to be a political battle precisely over the control of the new centers of power in the administrative apparatus. And given the overwhelming and tempting amount of authority that has been delegated to decision-making actors in bodies largely under executive control, given the discretion, the openness for creative interpretation, the poorly written pieces of legislation, the open-endedness of it, is it any surprise that we have an increasingly powerful presidency, which is still ambitious? To the point today where, and here I'm going to be in strong agreement with Chris DeMuth, I actually don't think his argument is that unusual at all. I think it's actually the natural response, given that executive-legislative relations for some time now has been a back-and-forth battle over who controls it, to the point where now modern presidents have extensive amounts of power, largely that's been delegated to them. Witness President Trump's turn to using emergency powers that Congress delegated, or at least wrote in law to the executive in 1976 as a way to try to control Richard Nixon after the Nixon presidency. The result of all this, it seems to me, is that separation of powers does not operate on behalf of the Constitution or the principles of limited government or consent, which means not the common good, or justice for that matter. The institutional separation of powers has been replaced by another battle, which I think we are in the midst of, whether we recognize it or not, which is between various forms of administrative rule, of which we spend inordinate amounts of time around the edges trying to improve it, and another argument which is trying to establish or maintain some semblance of the old order and self-government, increasing a battle over the very nature of the system itself, and oftentimes not within the system. Yes, we debate about whether we should have an Article 5 convention, or whether we should keep the Electoral College, or of late, court packing. But more and more, it's about just pursuing ends for the sake of those ends, regardless of the Constitution, reflecting our kind of post-constitutional situation we find ourselves in. How do we solve the problem? It seems to me that the control of the presidency has not resulted in a constitutional restoration the way it was thought of by Republicans in the second half of the 20th century. The Nixon administration, the Reagan administration. nor do I think the judiciary is going to solve the problem. I'm a great supporter of judges and appointments. I think Chris is completely right that there are going to be some very good things coming down the pike on non-delegation and the Chevron doctrine that will put pressure on Congress, but the notion that we're going to solve this larger crisis of constitutional government through lawsuit strikes me as insufficient at the very least. Among other things, I don't think the conservative judges themselves will make themselves vehicles of that change. They'll do more of a be in more of a holding pattern. The restoration of legislative power in the legislative branch, I think, is required, but it has not been very successful of late, and I say that as one who has advocated for some time. At the end of the day, we need a Madisonian solution, which is a robust competition of all three branches, ambitiously guarding their constitutional powers. But Congress is weak to the point that the other branches now carry out larger political legislative functions abdicated by Congress, while the bureaucracy does most of the day-to-day legislative work. Challenge is, how do we get this thing started? There seem to me to be very few incentives. I, too, like all the various reforms that have been suggested, but there is little interest in Congress to do any of those things. But I think we might be seeing one possibility right now in politics itself, within the realm of consent, which is a larger political battle outside the Beltway, as more and more people object to this new form of government and the way of life that's been foisted upon them by our ruling class or the intellectual elites. I like that term better than deep state. The Trump campaign and now administration has shown some limited signs of understanding the fight. I don't know that they've made a case, they haven't made a significant case for an alternative, but they have the right instincts, but it's not been put directly to the American people. But I think we might be approaching the point where we will have to make that choice one way or the other, given the fact that both political parties have gone back to those fundamentals. In short, I think it is the presidency, not Congress, not the courts, that might be the critical catalyst necessary to bring about the changes we seek. Partially because the presidency has an independent national electoral base, a different set of interests, but also partially because I think we have come to the point over time and debate in our politics with two long and well-established philosophies of governing that the choices are becoming increasingly clear and they are going to be political. And in the largest sense, I would argue the Madisonian sense, they will be partisanized. Whether we like it or not, it's best that we try to make a better argument of it, because I think at that level it's more likely to be decided. That leaves me to think that the battles, national battles, and the battles under the executive and how the executive might act, including sending things back to Congress. I think this president actually has done a decent job in doing so, but through elections in which the American people are broadly involved might be the best way and create the best conditions to not only revive Congress, but serve the larger objective, which is to revive a sense of a self-governing constitutional order by which the American people can see their consent and rights, their consent upheld and their rights protected. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yuval, by being the one who was brave to go first, or I asked you to be brave and go first, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on the presentations that followed, because there are a lot of interesting ideas in there, especially the idea that reform of Congress might come from the executive branch.
Yeah, I certainly think that's very interesting. I hope it's true, because it's hard to see it coming from Congress, as Chris suggested. I think it might be an only slightly unfair summary of the argument that Chris made to say that, in a sense, we're hoping that the president wants to be weak too. And for something like the reasons that Congress would, which is to say, we're asking too much of the president. And he should respond to that in part by saying, this is your job, to the Congress, which would be both a way to save the system and, in some respects, would be politically attractive to presidents who don't simply want every hard choice to be left to them. It seems to run counter to the notion that presidents should just want to do everything because that's the nature of political ambition, but it may be that the same logic that has worked on Congress to get members of Congress to a place where it's actually more appealing to them to say, you handle this, this is a hard one, might drive presidents to something like the same kind of logic and say, this part of what I'm being asked to do just isn't my job. It's your job, you handle it. You'd need a certain kind of partisan dynamics for that to work, but I actually think it is imaginable. It's not crazy or impossible to imagine. It is, though, it's a mark of how desperate we are that our hope lies in that kind of scenario, but here we are.
Now, we only have a few moments left, and I do want to give folks a chance to ask questions. So we still have some mics in the room. If anybody has a question, just raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and we'll find you. Okay, first question will be here in the first row.
I thank all the presenters for stimulating thoughts. I was particularly struck by Dr. Spaulding's comments about getting broader consent from the voters, not the president, but the people who put them into office. And it occurred to me that if we have significant gerrymandering, if we make it more difficult for individuals to vote or to register to vote, that is inhibiting the outside pressure on Congress. If you have basically Republican seats or Democratic seats because of gerrymandering, then you're diluting the power of the unsuccessful voters who voted for the Democrats or the Republicans, the losers. So should there be some attempt to reduce gerrymandering and to make it easier for people to register and for people to vote? And would that make it easier to put pressure onto Congress to assert their power?
Well, I'll just generally say, I mean, and this is partially building on what you've all said, I think it's important for us to realize that, and I think Chris made this point as well, right? I don't think that the solution is going to come within the Beltway. It's going to come without the Beltway. And as is perfectly natural and intended by the setup of the system, it has to be when Congress, the presidency, and the courts really can't resolve something, and I think we're at a point where I don't really want them to resolve this. I want to appeal to the American people and have a larger debate. I think we are in a period where we need to be very careful about the various changes that are being proposed and considered to our electoral systems. I think it's important to keep the drawing of districts at the state level and not bring those up to the national level. And make sure all those political systems are working well. I'm concerned about attempts to change the electoral, get around the electoral college. And my fear, to put it in very direct terms, which I don't necessarily intend in a partisan way, but can be understood in a partisan way, is that I am very worried that the modern progressive push for administrative norms has gotten to the point where we're in a fight for the future of the country. And I worry about a lot of people who are willing to go around and undermine various institutions of consent that will allow the American people to object to this, which is one reason why I think we need to appeal to them fast before we lost those opportunities. Because my fear is that the next round, think about all the things that could be locked in as a result of not getting some of these changes into the works.
Great. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. I want to thank all of our speakers on this panel and all three panels. Don't forget, our next event will be at the Decatur House on May 22nd on the President and the Civil Service. And then after that, we'll be back in the fall with new programming on campus in Washington and here on Capitol Hill. But please join me in thanking our speakers.